I'm Ross King. I teach Korean language and linguistics here in the Department of Asian Studies, but that's not why I'm standing before you, for quite obviously. I also serve as head of the Department of Asian Studies, and therefore it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Asian Center here and to the home of the Department of Asian Studies at UBC. Tonight, it is also my pleasure to welcome you all to the third annual Virani Lecture in Islamic Studies. It's well, we had an interesting dinner the other evening with the Viranis and our guest lecturers. And Sean Virani had mentioned, now that this is the third year, we sort of seem to be finding our groove in this series, and I think that is true. I'll come back to why I think so in just a minute, but first, let me just acknowledge and thank Mr. and Mrs. Amir and Yasmin Virani for their generous support of this event, and also, of course, their children, Sean and Anisha. And Anisha, unfortunately, cannot be here this evening. The Virani family established these lectures 3 years ago, and as a result, the groove that we've started to develop is really what I think, and what I certainly hope, is soon to become a flourishing of the study of Islam at UBC. So now I would like to turn over the mic to my colleague Ken Bryant, and it is surely a sign of the gravitas and the importance of this event that Ken is wearing a jacket this evening. And so without further ado, Ken, would you please introduce our speaker? Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, we stand at a kind of crossroads in the evening right now. You can spend the next hour in one of two ways. You can spend it listening to Professor Metcalf deliver her paper, or you can spend it listening to me read her much longer CV. So I'm going to spend very little time on the CV, but it is, as I say, considerably longer than the paper. Her academic career begins at least at the doctoral level, begins in Berkeley, the University of California, a fact for which I don't need the CV because I was there. Barbara and I completed our doctorates from the same department in the same year, all comparisons in at that stage. I remember her most clearly. I don't think we've met for 30 years now, but I remember her most clearly from Hindi lunches, Hindi and Urdu lunches, I should note, in the Lower Sproul Plaza, which I think we both attended, arranged by Gordon or Bruce. I also remember the fact that actually my wife has insisted that I thank you for supervising her MA thesis in, I think, 1972. Barbara went on to the University of California at Davis and then to the University of Michigan, where she has most recently occupied the, do I get this right, Alice Freeman Palmer Chair of History. And I should note that her field really is not just South Asian history, but that she is, at the moment, the president of the American Historical Association. So she carries South Asia glory into the wider academic world. She has an incredibly long bibliography, a list of works that she has written, which includes some 8 books. Most recently, a book co-authored with Tom Metcalf, who gave me the only B I received at the University of California. Remind Tom of that, please. They co-authored a concise history of modern India or modern South Asia? I forget. Modern India? One of those. And her articles cover, there are dozens of articles that cover an enormous range of topics, but finally the title of her presentation for tonight really is a summary to a considerable extent, I think, a summary description of Barbara's contribution to academia, a study of being Muslim in South Asia.
Ken, I'm at a loss, but thank you very much for that generous and funny introduction. A warm thanks from me to the Virani family for this wonderful occasion, and to all of the people at UBC who have given me and Kavita Dutla, the other Virani lecturers, such a wonderful welcome this past week. So thank you all too for being here. It is a rather odd title, but let me move on and explain it and plunge into this talk. The genesis for the talk is actually a volume of translated texts, primary documents, which a few dozen of us put together over the last few years for Princeton University Press. And this anthology took as its premise the idea that we need to sample lived experience, real people in real contexts, rather than generalize about Islam and Muslims from sacred texts, whose interpretation, after all, can never be the same everywhere. And so these three represent three of almost 36 voices that are represented in this collection. The South Asian subcontinent is a particularly rich site for this kind of study of Islam. Roughly 1 in every 3 Muslims worldwide lives in this area. We cover in this volume almost a millennium of history. We draw on a good dozen of different languages. The contributions describe different networks beyond the borders of what we demarcate as South Asia. Imagine the world of the medieval Indian Ocean traders, for example, reaching to East Africa, the Middle East, or beyond, or the world of the Coromandel Coast with its eastward connections, or the northern area, the music you heard a little bit of tonight, with its connections to Central and Southwestern Asia, areas in some parts often described as Persianate, because that language and that culture were so important for so many centuries. And then the port cities from the 16th century on, tied to Europe, to Portugal, Holland, France, and especially Britain. Each one of these areas had worlds of their own. And so when we draw the map of South Asia, that only begins to tell the story of the varieties of cultural experiences that we need to explore here. To continue this theme, Muslims today are divided among 7 nation-states in South Asia whose demographic and political characteristics vary widely. Pakistan, of course, stands with Israel as a new state, a rare state, created only on the basis of its population's religious identity. Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and the tiny Maldives, like Pakistan, have populations that make the Muslim majority nations. India, in contrast, is mostly non-Muslim, but its Muslim population is still the 3rd largest in the world. And in Sri Lanka and Nepal, like India, Muslims are a political minority. Different demographic patterns, different forms of government. So if you were to leap to one conclusion about Islamic practice in South Asia, it could assuredly be simply this: extraordinary diversity. This is no small conclusion, since so much in contemporary public life, with its talk of clash of civilizations and so forth, is geared to making generalizations based on the assumption that sacred texts can be taken literally, have a single meaning, and are shared uniformly. All too often, this has led to only negative stereotypes. So to simply insist on diversity alone, one might suggest, is an argument well worth making. So in picking the 3 figures of my title, the singer, the madman, and the schoolgirl, I was in part influenced by diversity. I don't know how well you can see the map, but each of these figures lived in a different part of the subcontinent. I think many of you know the map of South Asia, so I'll hope for that. The singer, Bir Fazl Shah, was a holy man, a spiritual guide, a poet. He wrote in Gujarati, a major language is associated with a state of the same name in modern India on the western coast, Gandhi state. Bir Fazl Shah flourished in the first half of the 1600s, died in 1654. Here's a modern edition of poems, not of his, but in the form he wrote, Genon. So these are poems that take on written form, are published widely. You can see a script there. There are many videos of Genon singers on the World Wide Web. You heard one as you came into the room. Oh, and now you're good. Thanks to Adhish, you're going to hear another one. Just for a minute. I don't have any other way to I don't have any way like this to introduce the other two, but I couldn't resist including just a touch of what the Genon might sound like in some settings. And you heard Genon singers from Hunza as you came in, from this fabulously beautiful high mountain kingdom in the Karakorams, far from Gujarat, far from the particular figure I'm talking about, a very dramatic area that shares a particular Ismaili orientation that produces the Genons. And I put that one in, again, just to suggest the diversity even just in the sound. Didn't that sound completely different, very Central Asian, to me almost a little in the twang of the voiced East Asian, so different from this kind of music. I hadn't realized, I might add, that in this series you had had substantial discussion of Genon in the year before last, I think. So in that way, we're providing, by chance, a little continuity. Now let me tell you just a word about the third figure. And as I say, I wish I did have a video to give you some idea of what he was like, because he's my Madman. The Madman takes us to the central interior of India, the colonial princely state of Hyderabad. And those of you who were privileged to hear Kavita's lecture a week ago today will be familiar with Hyderabad, which was the can I go back to the map? Not easily, but right in the center of India, the largest of the British princely states. States like Hyderabad, which were not directly ruled by the British, provided a contingent, was called a contingent of soldiers for imperial service. This is from the 20th century. Through the colonial period, these soldiers dressed up like toy soldiers, you might think. The contingent of soldiers provided by Hyderabad. And this madman, as we're calling him, Bane Mia, was himself a soldier, a sepoy. The top two picture cavalry and the bottom infantry. Is that what they're called? Before he began to be recognized as someone with powerful charisma who could intervene to solve personal problems. The contingent is perhaps a surprising institution for disseminating a form of Islamic authority, but through its networks, this former soldier, Bane Mia, addressed the spiritual and practical needs of a set of Indians of the time who were participating in a significant colonial institution. He operated outside the boundaries of normal conventional behavior. Bane Mia operated at the cusp of a certain kind of modernity in the early 20th century, where he could either be imagined as a divine madman, a figure cherished in art and poetry. And there is Majnun, perhaps the best known symbol of divine madness, a lover who is driven mad by his quest for beauty or the divine. Or he could be imagined, this single person, on the part of colonial authorities, as someone who belonged in a lunatic asylum. Stories about him were cherished by his followers and soon printed and disseminated in one of the most widespread South Asian languages of the time and since, Urdu. With the third figure, we go to another part of the Indian subcontinent, the northeastern area of what is now the independent nation of Bangladesh, and a 12th grade high school student. She, surprisingly perhaps, represents the learned scripturalist approach to Islamic studies, seeking in Quranic teachings guidance for proper Islamic behavior, like veiling and fidelity to prayer. She is part of an Islamic group influenced by one of the foremost Islamist thinkers of the 20th century, whose picture is here before you now, Abul Ala Maududi, whose ideas, I might add, were formulated in the princely state of Hyderabad. The woman of my discussion is a young woman of modest economic background, and in her Islamic activities, she aspires both to social respectability and skills, as well as moral achievement. She learns to deliver teachings to a group speaking in her native language of Bangla, and she learns a whole process of presentation, self-presentation, and mutual interaction with girls in her organization. So three figures from three different eras operating, one might suggest, in three different styles of Islamically sanctioned behavior and practice, each embedded in a distinctive linguistic and cultural setting. The poet who creates poetry meant to illuminate the inner meaning of Islamic teachings. The poems, as you heard, sung to rhythmic, evocative music that can transport hearers to ecstasy. The madman, with his charisma, operating, if you will, in the material realm, intervening to sustain followers in a world filled with uncertainty, disappointment, sickness, and hardship. The schoolgirl, aspiring to a life lived in accordance with normative Islamic teachings, rooted in Quranic injunctions and manifested in every aspect of everyday deportment and worship. These are fundamentally different ways of being Muslim. So I've introduced you briefly to these three figures, Bir Fazl Shah, Bane Mia, and Seema, as the ethnographer who describes her calls her. And I will be coming back to talk to each of them in more detail. But now what I want to do is ask a question. While insisting on diversity is itself an important intervention, one might well ask, are we then left with simply fragments? Is there any kind of generalization, any kind of interpretation that we can make for South Asian Islam? And basically what I now want to do is suggest three kinds of efforts people have made to impose unity on this kind of story. And just to give away where I'm going with that, I don't think any of them work. So let me begin by sketching out for you interpretations that have emphasized not fragments, but a single story. Because I feel that these stories, which become so much a part of people's common sense about Islam in South Asia, often obscure the lived experience, the voices of real Muslims. The subject of Islam everywhere bears the burden of heavily politicized distortion that comes from the colonial experience and that comes from nationalism. Colonialism, clear enough. South Asia by the mid-19th century was largely contained within the boundaries of British India. That was the map you saw. India had the longest and most intensive experience of European colonial rule anywhere. And a key part of the colonial legacy is a particular version of Islam and Muslim history in the area. And so the first story that is a single story of being Muslim in India, I'm calling the colonialist story. The locus classicus for this is a publication which in a way tries to do just what we did, to incorporate Muslim voices. The history of India as told by its own historian. 1849, a compilation of very problematic selections in 8 volumes taken largely from Persian sources. Purporting to convey a story about Muslims in India, it told instead, I would argue, a story about the British. Eliot, the editor, argued that it confirmed that Britain's colonial subjects had been delivered from oppression and granted the free gift of enlightened rule, a familiar colonial and neo-colonial trope to the present day. And of course, the professors were the Mohammedans. And let Eliot tell you, here's what he said. The common people must have been plunged into the lowest depths of wretchedness and despondency. The few glimpses we have, even among the short extracts in this single volume, of Hindus slain for disputing with Mohammedans, of general prohibitions against processions, worship, and ablutions, of other intolerant measures, of idols mutilated, temples razed, forcible conversions and marriage, prescriptions and confiscations, murders and massacres, and of the sensuality and drunkenness of tyrants who enjoined them, show us that this picture is not overcharged. These volumes, in case anyone missed the point, Eliot wrote, would make our native subjects more sensible of the immense advantages accruing to them under the mildness and the equity of our rule. On another occasion, we can talk about, say, the Mughal Empire as the richest, most stable, unified polity India had known and so forth, but that's not the point that he wanted to make. One of the key actors in Eliot's drama was the mid-11th century Sultan Mahmud, head of a Turkish-Afghan kingdom based in Ghazna in present-day Afghanistan. Mahmud became paradigmatic for the colonial view of the Muslim presence in South Asia. Later Hindu nationalist historians also fixated on the story of Mahmud's raids into the subcontinent, particularly the destruction of a temple located in Somnath in Gujarat. Somnath became a symbol that imagined the destruction of Hindu civilization by Muslims. In the midst of the unmitigated disaster of the first Afghan war, the first British-Afghan war, 1839 to 42, India's Governor General Ellenborough ordered one of his generals to secure a set of gates from Ghazna on the grounds that these were the very gates looted from Somnath. Ellenborough issued a triumphant declaration that with the return of these gates, quote, an insult of 800 years is at last avenged. The idea that a category of people called Indian had harbored this grievance for 8 centuries imputes an anachronistic nationalist homogeneity with no validity, in fact. It imagines geographic borders that did not exist. It also implies that Muslims were not the people of India, since it's the people of India who have been aggrieved. Although the fact was carefully kept under wraps, but I want you all to know, the gates turned out to have no connection with Somnath at all. And focusing on Muslim tyranny served Hindu nationalists as well as a way of explaining their weakness in the face of colonization. After independence, the Somnath Temple was rebuilt against Nehru's protest, and in 1990, a Hindu nationalist procession was launched from Somnath, part of the campaign many of you will remember that culminated in tearing down the Mughal-era Babri Masjid on the pretext that it was built on the site of the god Ram's birthplace, an event that led to substantial anti-Muslim violence. This retelling of historical stories do not occur in a vacuum, but serve functional ends. In this case, quite clearly, the whole campaign was used to generate some putative Hindu unity, to deflect lower caste demands for affirmative action, and to challenge the ruling government, issues that, in a sense, I would argue had nothing to do with Muslims at all. So that's one of the stories, that very powerful story that, as I say, becomes part of what's in the air, what people take for granted. There is another story, a second kind of story, that is a response. And instead of emphasizing Muslims as foreign conquerors, there's a story that emerges more in the 20th century from nationalists committed to a unified India and others, which is a peaceful story of Muslim accommodation to local practices as syncretic, hybrid, tolerant. One must note at the outset that this story shares the premise of two homogeneous cultures, India and Islam, and the formulation assumes an Islam already fully formed that comes into an India with certain characteristics, rather than imagining the historic Islamic tradition like any other tradition as one that takes shape in particular local contexts that changes and evolves over time. The story of accommodation emphasizes the importance of Sufi shrines, the kind of devotional music we heard tonight, customary celebrations of rituals, languages like Urdu, so Sufism on the one side, all of these others, what are things shared, and Hindu Bhakti movement, for example, on the other. This argument also often has as a kind of subtext that Islam in South Asia is different from Islam in the Middle East or Islam elsewhere, that here it is syncretic and tolerant. Clear enough, the political purpose is served by an argument like this. And today it would serve, if you will, to save Muslim Indians from discrimination as a minority, to give a cultural gloss to presenting them as true Muslim Indians. Alas, this story also serves Hindu nationalists who want to argue that Muslims and Christians are really Hindu with only a thin veneer, and that they ought to reject that veneer. It's a complicated story as well. The third story I'll just tell very briefly almost combines them. Maybe Muslims in India were once part of this synthesis, this story says, but there is an inexorable trend to what one historian calls the high Islamic tradition. Islam inevitably is stripped of local deviations, which now are imagined as a negative element, and toward a kind of pure, authentic, if you will, Islam. You can imagine that this story, too, has problematic implications for political life, in this case seeming to favor a version of a putative true Islam and the purification associated with many modern Islamic movements. I think it's worth spelling out these competing stories because, as I say, people are often not aware that they're shaping the way they think about Muslims. I want to emphasize again that each one of them is associated with a particular kind of implicit, maybe, political orientation. And if we turn back to each of our three figures and ask how each, in a sense, can be seen, I think it's fair to say that when we look at particular figures or particular moments, we find the limitations of the stereotypes these kinds of stories encourage. The first person I mentioned was the singer, and I took down one of his songs, and I'll just read it to you briefly. And you remember this was Bir Fazl Shah, who is writing in the early 1600s in Gujarat. How tired are my eyes from waiting expectantly, when will my Lord come, so that knowing him to be present before me, I may touch his feet. Beloved, bowing humbly, I will greet you. My master, I have been in love with you since childhood. I am in love with the Lord of the light. How can the ignorant possibly understand this? And this is the refrain all the way through this longer poem. Sweet Lord, I remember your name. O Lord, I remember your name. O Master, I remember your name. And I've read you the words, but you can imagine it if you were in Hunza or in Gujarat or in any number, or in Bengal, that these songs are sung in local languages over a very wide area. And to hear the words is very different from hearing them in the musical setting. This kind of devotional poetry evokes an individual's passionate longing for the divine. This poetry, like Sufi poetry generally, often celebrates a kind of progression in love, even a merger, through a human manifestation of divine truth. The bir represents a stage in love, merging with love, in this case for the Imam, for Hazrat Ali, for the Prophet Muhammad, for realizing the divine. And it is love, not mindless rituals, that leads one to the truth. The guide ambiguously is the master, who is at once these figures that I have mentioned. It is precisely this kind of devotional orientation, and if we go back here, in the Islamic tradition summed up as Sufism and summed up as bhakti on a range of Vaishnavite, Sikh, and other sacred traditions that proponents of a view of synthesis have particularly embraced. The example I gave you doesn't show this, but Ismaili poetry is particularly interesting because of the ease, in a sense, with which it incorporates local symbols, local images of that kind of passionate longing, so that Hazrat Ali, the first Imam, and the final incarnation of Vishnu, Kalki or Nakalanki, are merged. So you get very exuberant language that draws on the local tradition, with, if you will, the Imam and the avatar pointing to the same truth. And here, again, is in this painting a picture of one particular dimension of the way the love is imagined, and that is love and separation, which was a theme in that little snippet of a poem I read. The longing soul is in one place, the beloved somewhere else. And here in a Vaishnavite painting, we have the figure of the woman who is separated from the lover, the virahini, waiting, longing for the object of her devotion. It is meant to evoke the notion of the soul seeking union with the separated divine. And again, we looked at the picture of Majnun, which is this figure. This comes from this was taken from a poster of an exhibit held of the image of Majnun in Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Indian traditions. It is a favorite story of this mad and crazed lover who undergoes every hardship. Just look at him in this drawing as he seeks and basically destroys himself for love of the beauty. Just one example will complicate the argument that this orientation on the part of Pir Fazl Shah or others represents simply synthesis, Islam as some formal law and ritual which only in the context of India merges with traditions of devotion and love. Let's go back to Sultan Mahmud, whom we encountered as a warrior, which he certainly was, coming into Gujarat. But Mahmud, in fact, is cherished in Persian literary and mystic tradition as a kind of Majnun, as the besotted seeker of the divine, the seeker of the ideal beloved, whose earthly form was Mahmud's cherished slave Ayaz. So Islamic devotionalism, for one thing, flourished not only in India, but also through a broad swath of land, including Central and Western Asia, quite apart from any synthesis or blending with local Indian tradition. And so that's my comment of this example on the second story. And now I want to make a comment on the colonialist story, the one that thinks you can sum up the story of Mohammedans in India as, you know, the unique violent oppressors. So if Mahmud's devotional style was one not defined by rigid boundaries of different historic traditions, his militant style was not uniquely Muslim either. If one studies the period in which he operated, Mahmud simply becomes ordinary. Raids like his were part of the culture of the times, when genealogies, epics, folklore celebrated warfare and valor on all sides. Mahmud and the Ghaznavids at one end of the subcontinent were, after all, contemporaries of the great Chola dynasties of the southeast, a Hindu dynasty whose conquests at this point extended from the Maldives across the south, with raids as far north as Orissa and eastward toward Southeast Asia. At the time, Mahmud's raids were not at all the defining event they became in modern nationalist ideology. If you go back to contemporaneous texts and epigraphy, you get a very different picture. Mahmud did indeed seize the wealth of Hindu temples, but he was only one of many marauders, including pirates, Hindu rajas, and others who were lured particularly to the prosperous and fertile hinterland of the Northwests. Temples, as sites of accumulation and investment of wealth, were always a major magnet for raids. And finally, if Hindu rajas as well as Mahmud, a further comment on the first story, were raiding temples, it's also noteworthy, lest one assume, as nationalist historians do, a monolithic Islam, that Mahmud justified his incursions into the subcontinent on the grounds that some of the rulers of the area adhered to the Shi'i, Ismaili, and Karmatian heresies, the very tradition of which Bir Fazl Shah was a later heir. He claimed that this was a legitimate jihad to stamp out the heretics. Anyone who wanted to be a political power in these centuries had to be an equal opportunity raider. So he was perfectly happy to attack Muslims in Gujarat, perfectly happy to move into Persian areas farther west that were Muslim, perfectly happy to take the Somnath temple. The examples of Mahmud and Bir Fazl Shah help us move beyond binaries of monolithic Islam and Hinduism. They undermine, I think, both the colonialist story of singular Hindu-Muslim antagonism and its intended rebuttal in the story of synthesis and harmony that excludes the multiple forms of violence that existed, and I think misrepresents cultural change. Now our second figure, Bani Mia. The picture on the screen, in pre-colonial India as elsewhere, actions and states of mind that violated established customs could be interpreted as marks of divine grace and favor, of being majzub, maddened by jazb, or attraction to the divine, or the word we've used here, majnoon, whose Arabic root is jinn. So majnoon, literally possessed by jinn, as in this famous story. the theme of love and separation, as we've talked about. In the guise of a holy fool, such figures were regarded as powerful channels of God's grace and intervention. Such figures were not spiritual guides, like Pir Fazl Shah, nor were they teachers, as we'll meet in our final example. The maddened fool, the maddened lover, these figures were signs of God's power in the world, which is able to disrupt ordinary life and to succor the faithful. There was always a tension in identifying such figures as holy and not simply crazy, immoral. This tension, as I mentioned before, was greater in colonial times when the British had no concept of divine madness. And when the divine madness mocked their institutions, they particularly had a stimulus to label the divine madman as simply mad. Bane Mia, 20th century figure from the final decades of colonial rule, as I mentioned above, was a soldier in the Hyderabad contingent. His father had been as well. The contingent was commanded by British officers, was an important arm of colonial authority in a state that, in principle, had internal autonomy. It was after Bane Mia was dismissed, and in fact put into a lunatic asylum, that he began his unruly career of miracles, many of which were focused on outwitting representatives of the empire. Like a child or a bridegroom, Bane Mia, he represented freedom and play in a world too often filled with setbacks, constraints, and rules that made no sense. His followers emphasized that he was the inheritor of an important Sufi lineage, and he underwent great privations in worship and wandering. Both of these characteristics were intended to show that he was not simply unruly, not simply mad, but the real proof was in his interventions. His cannabis pipe cured snake poison. He could speak to followers in whatever language they spoke to him. People would close him up in jail, the British, and he would escape. He infected a staid merchant, an Arab merchant in Hyderabad, with such divine frenzy that he too began to dance. He rescued a man's wife despite confusion with the police. He could produce perfect food, preserve followers from forced inoculation, rescue a foundering ship en route to Hajj. He could even make it rain. And here's one story. Ghulam Hussain Khan was a private in the 1st Cavalry of the Hyderabad contingent, stationed in the cantonment. One day he was in the cavalry. "Hey, Dafadar, where are you going?" Ghulam Hussain turned and respectfully said, that was Bane Mia speaking, said to him, "I'm only a sepoy, I'm not an officer." But His Holiness Bane Mia said, "No, you are an officer." Later that day, Ghulam Hussain Khan rode his new horse before Major Colonel Ross. Ross saw Ghulam Hussain and said, "Who is that sepoy?" And the cavalry officer said, "Oh, he's just a sepoy, sir." But Major Colonel Ross said, "That person has the qualifications to be an officer, and so I am going to appoint him as one." And of course, that was Bane Mia's intervention. Ghulam Hussain Khan went before His Holiness to pay the respect of kissing his feet. By the time of Bane Mia in the 1920s, he died, narratives of Islam and Muslims in India were crystallizing around either the story of separation and difference or the story of melding. These are stories that in some ways exclude this kind of Islamic practice. But the example of Bane Mia especially undermines the narrative of story 3 that posits a progressive move to normative Islam, a stripping away of what can be seen as customary practice or deviance in place of normative Islam. There emphatically have been important Islamic reform movements in the 20th century. That is a very important theme in the history of modern Islam. But people like Bane Mia remind us that the reformist trend is not the whole story, and that figures like him, responding to new challenges of their followers, play a significant role in the 20th century by helping their followers navigate and cope with the day-to-day perils of everyday life. I'll leave Seema. And that brings us to our final voice, that of a young Bangladeshi woman. Now, the setting for the text in your mythical handout is a hot, humid, sunny afternoon in a lower middle-class neighborhood of Dhaka. A half dozen girls gather at the home of Polly, the chairwoman of a cell of BICSA, the Bangladesh Female Students Islamic Association, for one of their regular gatherings for instruction, or durs. These gatherings are common across a wide range of organizations today. Tablighi Jamaat does something very similar. And they're very important. They mark what I call a kind of laicization of Islamic authority, a major trend of the modern period, thanks substantially to print media that has opened scholarly knowledge way beyond the boundaries of the ulama, of the Islamic scholars trained in madrasas. On this occasion, the girl students who gather had been told a few weeks earlier that the subject would be 2 verses from a particular chapter of the Quran. This was the way they operated. None of them knew who would be called on to speak, but everyone in principle came to the meeting prepared, just in case she was the one who got the nod that day. I want to describe the setting because it gives you an idea of the social class and the kind of background of someone who is operating this way. The home where they met was only 2 rooms, a small one barely big enough for a single bed used by the parents, a larger one for Polly, a first-year college student, and her sister, which included a small table for the girls' studies, as well as the kerosene stove, utensils, a bamboo mat. That, in a sense, was the equivalent of a kitchen. Mud floor, tin walls and roof, an old ceiling fan that barely turned around, probably making a noise. So the half dozen girls gathered in a circle in the girls' room, mostly sitting on the bed. And although they uncovered their faces, none removed their tight head covering or the long robe covering their kurta pajama. Polly placed before her Maududi's commentary, you saw his picture, her own notebook, and an organizational notebook, because she would record everything that happened that in due course would be handed up the organizational ladder to her superiors, who would then in turn advise her and so forth. The excerpt that I chose gives just a short segment of the durs that Seema gave on that occasion. She said, what does Allah say in verse 286? It's the Surah Baqarah. He says, quote, Allah does not lay a responsibility on anyone beyond his capacity. We must not mistakenly use this verse as an excuse for not practicing this or that command of Allah, because all Islamic requirements, such as veiling, struggling to establish Islam, praying, have always been well within human ability to follow. A second thing to note about verse 286 is that it ends with, quote, help us in our encounter with the unbelievers. This is important for the moral training of Islamic movement workers. Here, Muslims are being told not to channel their emotions in an erroneous manner, but to cultivate these in accordance with prayer. We must not express any arrogance or irritation or anger toward our opponents, but must pray for their guidance and must try to respond to them in an intelligent manner. And then when she finishes, Polly, the chairwoman of the group, who's probably a year older than the others, in her reply says, Alhamdulillah, Seema has recited well, and inshallah, she will benefit from the other sisters' important comments on pronunciation and practice. Seema has presented the durs beautifully. As we learned today and have heard many times before, our responsibilities are ultimately assigned from above, and Allah never delegates responsibilities in excess of our abilities. To many, we represent true Islam. We are role models. This means Allah would hold us responsible should anything in our behavior or deeds misguide anybody in any way and lead others, that person and others, toward bad deeds. I conclude with Seema's voice because her example seems to me so important for the value of looking at Islam in practice. As I mentioned earlier, Biqsa is loosely affiliated with Jamaat-e-Islami, the organization founded by Abul Ala Maududi in Hyderabad in 1943 or something like that. Exactly. Maududi was himself, look at his dress even, not a seminary graduate. His relationship to the ulama was always a little stressful. He disapproved of them and vice versa. That's not stressful, that's pretty clear. Indeed, central to his teaching was to challenge the mainstream ulama. He held out as a goal an Islamic state, very much in the spirit of other mid-20th century visions like fascism and communism. And like communism, his organization was imagined not as a mass movement, but as a vanguard, until such time as society as a whole was ready for an Islamic order. His kind of vision is what we properly should call Islamist. It is a statist vision. To this end, as many of you probably know, he supported neither the Congress nor the Muslim League in their respective independence movements, and he forbade his followers to even vote or participate in non-Islamic systems. This is in the years leading up to independence. But look at what we learn from not reading Maududi's texts, but looking instead at actual practice. And the Jamaat is terrific for this, because if you look, and I don't have time to do this today at all, but if you look at the Jamaat-Islami, which forms in separate national organizations, you have virtually for a laboratory of what becomes of the Jamaat in Pakistan, what becomes of it in India, what becomes of it in Bangladesh, Kashmir, and so forth. Because in each case, quite simply, the organization takes largely the shape of the larger society. It's a very interesting case in that regard. And I might just mention India. The Jamaat has been utterly transformed. Maududi is still respected, as Seema does in Bangladesh. They read his Quranic commentary, for example. His scholarly work is admired. But the Jamaat today in India is completely an educational and social work organization. Jamaat-Islami Hind is not a political party, and its members vote, as does presumably every other Indian, for whatever party they believe will serve their interests or the common good. Whatever motivates people to vote is true here too. My favorite factoid from the web is that the Indian Jamaatis serve vegetarian food at their annual meeting so that non-Muslims will feel welcome. And then if we generalize, even in Bangladesh, where we can talk about Jamaat-e-Islami as a political party, do we learn what this practice on the part of Seema means from either reading Maududi or looking at politics? I think the answer is no. What is important to her, we can judge, has little to do with political action, and very explicitly, her organization is apolitical. She is concerned to fulfill Islamic teachings, to be a good role model, to cultivate a certain moral disposition, right? She's learning not to be angry, so forth. But she's also learning to acquire middle-class skills. Did you notice Polly said that they would be paying attention to her Bangla pronunciation, so that she's learning in this context from this humble beginning to present herself with the kind of skills that someone from a higher class family might come by naturally. Public speaking, standard pronunciation, sort of a graciousness in a public setting, and so forth. However modest her background, she is emerging as a person of respectability, a person meriting respect. So often, if an outsider knows that Bangladeshi women dress like this, and then see a woman dressed like this, they assume that this dress must go with being obscurantist, militant, and so forth. And even from this little snippet, I think we can see that the implications of her choice of dress go with a whole different set of goals. And what about the larger narratives reviewed earlier? Seema and her friends would seem to illustrate story 3, the so-called inexorable trend toward normative Islam. But the activism of movements of Islamic reform, as her case makes clear, is enormously varied. And BICSA in many ways seems like any number of improving voluntary organizations oriented to youth across religious denominations. And of course, to go back to the conclusions from the earlier examples, shared practices like the mystic devotionalism exemplified by the beer and the painting in contemporary forms flourish today. Sites of graves, and Bane Mia's grave in Aurangabad is one of them, as well as charismatic living individuals, are important today as they were in the past. Thus, to suggest that the trajectory toward reformist Islam is always the same, we know what that means, or that it exhausts modern Islamic practice is simply wrong. Even story number 3 is far more complicated than it seems. And so to conclude, even these 3 brief snippets, I hope, suggest the complex array of human projects at stake when individuals engage with Islamic religious thoughts, symbols, practices, and institutions. People set out to find a trustworthy spiritual guide, as Bir Fazl Shah's example holds out. They look for healing and help with spouses and jobs and shipwrecks and government imbroglios, just as did the sepoys who encountered Bane Mia. And Seema shows us another variation of the efforts to live a moral life coupled with efforts to master skills and behaviors linked to respectability and a form of social mobility as well. In these examples, we also find a quest for pleasure, the pleasure that we tasted a tiny bit of transcendent music, the pleasure of hearing entertaining stories about a holy man. I should have tried to get a picture of that, but Bane Mia's stories circulated in printed forms. The pleasure of offering hospitality in one's own humble setting, mud floor and tin roof. Such specific stories about the ways in which Islamic symbols and institutions work may make for less tidy stories than the ones I sketched out earlier. But given the stereotypes and problems such stories have often generated in the past, we can see the advantage of placing Muslims in specific contexts and finding specific categories to understand them. This approach helps counter the assumption, one perhaps particularly pervasive in the case of Islam, that a given religion presents timeless universals. The strategy is to shift the lens toward Muslims and away from Islam, and recognize that Islam is always processed through human eyes, with real people engaging with historic Islamic tradition in what always turns out to be a wide and perhaps even unexpected diversity of ways.